Okay. Yeah. So today we are diving into the endocrine system. So we wrapped up the stuff on the nervous system last week, and now we'll have 2 weeks on the endocrine system. And so the pre-class video was a lot of information about kind of just background information on how the endocrine system works. And uh, and now I would like to do just a couple things to kind of review that, make sure we're on the same page for a few of those key issues before we move forward. So this is one of those new slides. Okay. So um, yeah, so take a sec with the person next to you and just kind of review these things. So what are the distinguishing characteristics between those three different kind of control mechanisms in the body: nervous, endocrine, and the neuroendocrine? Okay. And then this other key issue of how hormones act and how they interact with a cell. Okay. And so, yeah, which ones typically act intracellularly instead of extracellularly? Okay. So extracellularly would mean binding to a receptor on the outside of the cell versus getting inside the cell somehow and then acting. Okay. So just, yeah, check on these things with each other real quick. This is also one of those new slides. Well, we can kind of, if you get done with that first part and we're not back together yet, you can kind of talk about these things as well. And then we are going to recap just the posterior pituitary hormones as well. And so all throughout the next couple of weeks, we'll have chances to kind of draw out hormone control loops like this one. This one gives you the structure for it already with stimuli, hormone released, and then the effects. Okay. But we'll kind of just start off class by recapping these things. So give you a few minutes just to kind of work through those, and then we'll come back together here in a sec.
Steroids and oh no. No. Yeah. Sorry. No, 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 you're good.
Say it again.
She's teaching me text stuff.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. With the notes out. Yeah. Oh, there you go. On the iPad. Yeah, that is nice.
Without any help. Oh, that makes sense.
No, it isn't. I'm practice right.
All right, let's go ahead and come back together here. We can work through some of this together. So we've got these three kind of control mechanisms, right? Nervous, endocrine, neuroendocrine. the first thing that distinguishes them is the type of cell that releases the chemical, right? So in the nervous system, what is that type of cell? Neuron, okay, I got that. All right, so neuron releases in the endocrine system, what type of cell? Huh? What type of cell does the releasing in the endocrine? Yeah, some kind of glandular cell. Okay, and then in the neuroendocrine, which type of cell is it? Neuron again, right? Yeah, so that's kind of distinguishing characteristic number one is what type of cell does the releasing, and then the second one is where does it release into, right? So in the endocrine system, sorry, in the nervous system, it releases into what? The synapse. Yeah, just that space between the neuron and the target tissue. There's that diffusion space, right? So in neuron releases into the synapse, okay? Um, and then in the endocrine system, what does it release into? The blood. Yeah, really it releases into extracellular space, and then that's going to diffuse really quickly into the blood right there. And then in the neuroendocrine releases into the blood again. Yeah. So that's a key thing. And then it's just kind of what we call that thing that gets released, right? So in the nervous system, what do we call that chemical? Neurotransmitter. We've been talking about those a bunch. Okay. In the endocrine system, called a hormone, right? In the neuroendocrine, usually called a neurohormone. Okay. So you can always kind of, if you know what the tissue is that's doing the releasing and where it's releasing into, then you can kind of decide how it's categorized, right? And so that's one key thing just to kind of keep in mind as we move through. Secondly, most hormones act on the outside of cells, right, with receptors, but then we have groups that don't, groups that get inside the cell somehow, okay? The main big group of hormones that go right through the membrane and get inside the cell is what? Say it a little bit louder. Yeah, steroid hormones, right? Steroid-based hormones. So cholesterol based hormones, they're lipid soluble, right? That's the why. They're lipid soluble, so they can get through those plasma membranes without really any special help. And then they bind to receptors on the inside. Okay, it can be intracellular receptors that are just floating around in there. It can be some receptors that are kind of bound to the nucleus of that cell. There's a couple different types that it can interact with. Okay, and then the other group of hormones that gets inside of cells as well is which ones? The thyroid hormones. Yeah, and thyroid hormones are amine hormones, meaning that they're modified amino acids, right? And they don't actually just get right through the membrane like the steroid hormones do. They do need some help. They get some, there's different transport proteins that get them through, but they get inside the cell and have their action inside. Okay. That's just kind of a key thing to remember. And then which ones also need transport proteins? The same ones, right? Yeah, pretty much the same ones. So that's just kind of a way to remember this. Is going to be steroids and thyroid hormones. Okay. There's some other ones that utilize transport proteins to some extent, like catecholamines, like norepinephrine and epinephrine. About half of those are bound to transport proteins, but these ones really need transport proteins to do much of anything, right? The why on that for the steroids is because they're hydrophobic, right? So they don't travel well in water, right? For the thyroid hormones, they're just charged and they tend to stick to a lot of things along the way, so they don't move very well when they're traveling through the blood. Okay. All right. Questions on any of those concepts? Okay, so then this concept of a portal system is just a little bit tricky sometimes to wrap your head around. So I wanted to just kind of recap it here and bring it back up. So this idea of a portal system, okay? How's it different than our normal vascular setup? Anybody want to explain that for us? portal system? Joseph, what do you got?
There's like two different capillary beds.
Okay. Yeah, two different capillary beds, right? That's really the key. The normal setup would be, heart to arteries to capillaries to veins back to the heart, right? In this case, we've got two capillary beds, right? So we go heart to arteries to capillary beds to veins to another set of capillary beds to more veins and then back to the heart, right? So typically when we have something like this, that second capillary bed has a different function than what we're normally thinking about when we think about capillary beds, right? We're normally thinking about dropping off oxygen, picking up waste products, right? Dropping off nutrients. But that second one, we've already dropped off the oxygen, right? The oxygen's already dropped off. We've already done some extraction. So that second one always has a different function, right? So in this case, I've kind of got them labeled here, right? Our first capillary bed up here. We can see, I like this image because it shows we've got these hypothalamic neurons, right? Neurons from the hypothalamus that send their axons down to the stalk part of the pituitary, right? It's like the infundibulum is what it's called, this little stalk that connects the hypothalamus and the pituitary, right? And so those neurons end right here at a capillary bed, right? So that's our first capillary bed. So the hypothalamic neuron or hypothalamic hormones, which are really neurohormones, right? Because they're neurons releasing into the blood right here, are getting released into that first capillary bed. Okay, so role number one would be to pick up hypothalamic hormones. All right, so that's number one. We're picking up those hypothalamic hormones that are released by those neurons, or we could call them hypothalamic neurohormones. And we're getting oxygenated blood dropped off there too, right? We're seeing the oxygenated blood come in, right? So also, I'll just say also oxygen would be part of number one, right? Because we're seeing that oxygenated blood come in. So we're getting oxygen delivered there too. Okay. And then those hormones are going to travel down, right? Travel down this way through some little veins between the two sections. And then we get to the anterior pituitary. And then that second capillary bed again is the purpose number one is to drop off those hypothalamic hormones, right? And then those go in, interact with our pituitary cells, anterior pituitary cells, tell them to release certain hormones. And then that capillary bed has to act to pick those ones up too, right? Pick up those ones that are released by the pituitary, right? And then they can get into the bloodstream and go out. Okay, I know I wrote that on the video once. I don't think I'm going to try to write it there because I think it'll just get really messy, but I can recap it again. Number one is pick up drop off the hypothalamic hormones to the pituitary, right? Number one, they diffuse out of that capillary bed number two, go interact with the pituitary cells, right? They tell those cells to release their hormones, right? So it could be growth hormone, would be an example, right? Growth hormone stimulated to be released because of that GHRH, right? Growth hormone releasing hormone that's released. And then those cells that make growth hormone release growth hormone out into the interstitial space. It goes into that capillary bed, and then growth hormone can travel through the body, right? So dropping off hypothalamic hormones in number two, and then picking up pituitary hormones also in number two. Okay, we'll talk about a portal system in the digestive tract coming up soon too, right? That's also where we have two capillary beds. The second one is about delivering nutrients to the liver, right? So, okay, questions on that part? What's going on there? Okay. What about our posterior pituitary? This over here is the posterior pituitary, right? So would we call this an endocrine gland, neuroendocrine gland, or a part of our nervous system? Actually, the easier way to ask it to align with what we were talking about before would be, would we call the hormones released here neurotransmitters, hormones, or neurohormones? Ask each other that real quick. What would we call these hormones? There's really just the two we talked about, right? Vasopressin, prolactin. Okay, so what do we got here? Is this endocrine or neuroendocrine? Neuroendocrine for sure, right? Because it's just axons from the hypothalamus coming down. That's what make up the gland, right? It's just the end of those axons that make up the gland. There's two different groups of neurons up there. One of them produces ADH or vasopressin. The other one produces oxytocin. Okay, so that they travel down the axon via that axonal transport that we talked about, right? And then they're going to be released. They can get released right into this capillary bed and go out to the body. Okay, so this is all definitely neuroendocrine, right? We only need one capillary bed because we don't have a series of two things going on, right? It's not like there's hypothalamic hormones that are causing the release of things from the posterior pituitary. It's all just one system, right? It's just axons of the hypothalamus that do the releasing here. Okay, questions on that one? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, can you just repeat why we only need one capillary bed?
Yeah, because in this case, I mean, with the anterior side, we could technically, if those neurons went all the way down to the anterior pituitary and they made all of the hormones that the anterior pituitary gland makes, then that would kind of cut out the need for that first capillary bed, and we would just have the one, right? Because we're just picking up what the neurons are releasing. That's exactly the case in the posterior pituitary, right? The neurons are just releasing things right into the capillary bed, and that's the final product that gets released. But on the anterior side, we've got, first of all, neurohormones that stimulate the release of something else in the pituitary, right? So we need the first capillary bed to pick up the first ones, second capillary bed to pick up the second ones, right? So yeah, so all of the all the posterior pituitary hormones are made in the hypothalamus, right? Because they're made up there and then they travel down for release in the posterior pituitary. Okay, other questions on that? Okay, so then let's kind of walk through this. With all of these hormone loops, we'll have a stimuli we'll have stimuli or a stimulus, okay? So when we talk about vasopressin, or we can call it ADH, the stimulus, one stimulus is low blood volume. Another one would be hyperosmotic blood. What are both of those things associated with? Low blood pressure and dehydration, right? Yeah, right. So low blood volume, hyperosmotic blood, it means we've lost water, right? If we low blood volume probably means we've lost both water and salt, but hyperosmotic blood means we've lost more water than we have the solute, right? And so that's going to lead to the release of vasopressin. And then the key effects are water retention, and thirst. All right, so then the overall effect is going to be an increase in blood volume, increase in blood pressure. All right, and then a decrease in osmotic pressure of the blood. Right, it's pretty much just reversing the top two things, right? So our blood volume is going back up, osmotic pressure of the blood can go back down, and then that results in an increase in blood pressure. Okay, so we're taking in more water, we're holding on to more water, right? These water retention effects are going to be taking place in the kidneys. We don't really get to that until the end of the semester, towards the end of the semester, but we'll talk about more of the details of how that works when we get there. But that's it for now. Okay, questions on that one? Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
Could this also be stimulated instead of just low water and lost more water than salt? Could you also cause this by like intaking more salt? Let's say you just slam a lot of Taco Bell and don't drink any water.
Mhm.
With that, would that do this?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. Yeah, so we'll get into those details a little bit more in the kidney section, but we have osmoreceptors in certain parts of our body that are sensing that, and then we have volume receptors that are sensing it too. And yeah, and so they both have the effects. We'll talk about how one kind of tends to be the dominant one. But yeah, for sure. Eating lots of salt without water can do the same thing as losing lots of water, but not as much salt. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Deja? Hyperosmotic blood. Yeah, hyperosmotic blood. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Other questions on that? Yeah, okay. So then when we talk about oxytocin, we've got three primary stimuli. So nipple stimulation, stretch of the uterus, and stimulation of the cervix. And then all of these things can lead to oxytocin release, which then lead to contraction of smooth muscle of some sort. Okay. So with nipple stimulation, it's going to lead directly to the letdown reflex, which is really what causes milk release in breastfeeding. Okay. And then it's just going to be contraction of the uterus or contraction and contraction of the cervix. Oxytocin is one of the hormones that can kind of flip towards positive feedback during labor and delivery. And some oxytocin release leads to more oxytocin release, which leads to more contraction of the uterus, which is what leads to labor, right? And then when we talk about the synthetic version of that hormone, Pitocin, right? Pitocin is what stimulates labor when you're trying to do that. Okay. All right. So that's just kind of a recap of what we talked about. Yeah, go ahead, Kyle.
Action, or is it that much?
Yeah, cervical contraction, which kind of like thins out the cervix, and then kind of pulls it apart. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Other questions on that? Okay. All right. So then, yeah. So then let's switch gears to the stuff for today, which was not on the video. So we'll start with growth hormone as our first hormone that we talk about here. And this is a nice little flow chart here. We'll kind of have flow charts like this for all of our hormones. We have two different hypothalamic hormones involved in this process. Okay. And the stimulation for release here, there's a bunch of them. So one of those would be sleep. That looks like a T, should be an L. Exercise. Ghrelin release, right, which is a hunger hormone. We're seeing that right here. Okay. Certain amino acids. So like leucine, for example. Yeah. Say it one more time. Ghrelin. Yeah. The same word is right here. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So ghrelin release, a hunger hormone. And then, yeah. And so just kind of stressful stimuli is the other kind of primary, a primary stimulator of growth hormone. Okay, so that stress could include exercise, could include other things as well. So yeah, so lots of different stimuli. Oh yeah, and one more I even missed would be hypoglycemia. Okay, so lots of different stimuli here. And then the stimuli is really going to be causing an increase in GHRH, right? So growth hormone releasing hormone, right? Which is then going to lead to increase in growth hormone, right? From the anterior pituitary. And then that growth hormone is going to go all over the body and have some direct effects. We'll see that in a second. But then it's also going to go to the liver and cause IGF-1 release. So increased IGF-1. And that's the primary thing that's actually going to cause growth. So there's different groupings of effects with growth hormone. There's kind of its direct effects, and then there's its indirect effects that happen through IGF-1. So the inhibition for this, we can see here with the dotted line, right? Anytime we see those dotted lines, that's where we know it's the negative feedback part of this, okay? So we've got the inhibition is going to be caused by that increase IGF-1, okay? And an increase in somatostatin, that's what the SS is there, which is also known as GHIH. This growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Yeah. The IGF-1 stuff I wanted to say right there was just that part about that's the hormone that's causing the growth. Okay, so we've got lots of different stimuli. One of the key ones there to talk about is sleep, right? Because that's a key part for, especially for training adaptations, for exercise, muscle growth, things like that. If you're doing all that, doing a lot of training but not getting enough sleep, then you don't really get the primary effects that you need from growth hormone. So, okay, questions on that so far? Okay, so what are the actions of growth hormone? Okay, again, as I was saying, we kind of have the direct effects versus indirect effects that are stimulated or that are mediated by IGF-1. So all the blue ones here are the direct effects. Okay, so those would be sodium retention, decrease insulin sensitivity, breaking down fat, starting some protein synthesis, and growth of our epiphyseal plates in our bones, if we're talking about somebody a kid that still has those open, right? But then the other ones related to IGF-1 are going to be kind of anti-lipolytic activity, right? So stopping the breakdown of fat, causing direct protein synthesis, epiphyseal growth, and then insulin-like activity as well. That's why it's called insulin-like growth factor. Okay, so these somatomedins are what IGF is grouped into, right? So IGF-1 is also called somatomedin C, and this is released without growth hormone before birth, but then after birth, it's required to have growth hormone for its release. And IGF-2, we see more of that in kids, and especially during fetal development is the primary time this is going to be key. Okay. Other questions on that? Okay, so a couple growth hormone abnormalities, right? So excessive growth hormone can lead to two different conditions. If this is happening before growth plates are closed, so pre-puberty, as well as into puberty, then that's going to lead to, so we'll just write it here, before growth plate closure. All right, this is going to lead to gigantism. So that makes the bones really long, right? And thick, okay? Because they can grow in length at that point still, right? But then if we get a post-puberty excess after those growth plates are closed, then that leads to what's called acromegaly. Acromegaly is just thickening of bones, right? Because they can't grow in length anymore at that point, right? So they have real large hands, feet, thick bones, big jaw, protruding eyebrows, right? but this can be definitely damaging to the health, with organs getting larger than they need to, like the heart, and the liver. This was Andre the Giant, who was part of the WWF back in the day. Ever remember him? Seen pictures of him? Yeah, just this massive dude. There he was in his peak. It was 7'4", 520 pounds. So just a massive guy standing next to like a normal sized man there, and the security guard, right, just looks like totally different thing altogether. But yeah, he had both. He just had continued excessive growth hormone release throughout his whole life, and so got really tall, got really big. He eventually died of heart failure. Right? So enlargement of organs, including the heart, is something that happens. So there is potential treatment for this, right? So a lot of times this excessive release is caused by a tumor. So if you get rid of that tumor, that can help. But then it can also kind of antagonize growth hormone receptors throughout the body as well with certain medications that can slow down the activity of excessive growth hormone as well. So, yeah, questions about that? Yeah.
If you have the pre-puberty excess, are you more likely to have post-puberty excess?
If they don't stop it, yeah, I mean, it's really more of a thing where finding the cause and then dealing with it. But yeah, if it's not dealt with, then yeah, yeah. But nowadays, most times it is dealt with pretty quickly, if possible. But and for the most part, it is because it's usually the primary cause is a tumor. But yeah, yeah.
So the pre-puberty excess leads to like just excessive growth across the entire body versus post-puberty is more in like secondary.
Yeah, and it's more just kind of that those symptoms are kind of for acromegaly is just kind of where we can see it, right? But it still leads to enlargement of organs and things like that too, which is damaging for sure. And it's probably, a little the acromegaly one, if left untreated, be a little bit more like have longer term health implications than just like a gigantism that was kind of treated after it was noticed kind of thing. But yeah, other questions on that? Okay, so then the other side of things, dwarfism, right? And that's Peter Dinklage, which some of you probably know from what's the main shows you guys know him from? Yeah, it's a lot, right? Yeah, for sure. I always think of him from Elf. Elf is the one I always think of, but most people say the Game of Thrones is what most people say now, but yeah, but he's a fantastic actor for sure. Um, the jump kick in Elf is the best. Call me Elf one more time, and it's takes out Will Ferrell. But yeah, so this can have lots of different causes, right? There's no one singular cause that causes all forms of dwarfism. There's lots of different forms of it. So it could be a deficiency of that hypothalamic hormone. GHRH, could be a deficiency of growth hormone itself, could be IGF-1 deficiency, it could be lack of growth hormone receptors, which is a lot harder to treat. It's not really very treatable. Okay, that's what leads to Laron dwarfism, which is one of the more common types. And then, yeah, childhood hypothyroidism is another version of this. This is what's kind of commonly, so hopefully less commonly, now known as cretinism, which is not the preferred term of it, but your textbook actually still uses that term. So that's why I felt like it was important to put that in here. That's typically kind of thought of as a derogatory term for people that don't have full brain development, because part of hypothyroidism as when you're a baby and when you're a kid is lack of neural development. But it also, thyroid hormones boost your metabolism, keep your metabolism going, so you can't grow as well if you don't have thyroid hormones on board. So it leads to mental retardation, but also can lead to dwarfism as well. And then another somewhat common version of dwarfism, this achondroplasia, which is issues with the fibroblast growth factor 3, and this can lead to more dealing with cartilage. And so this is the most common type, which just leads to mostly short limbs, are kind of the primary thing. Um, and and for the types of growth of dwarfism that we can treat, hormone replacement is the primary treatment, right? So if they're lacking growth hormone, we can give growth hormone synthetically. right? But if they're lacking the receptors, that's not really something that we can do much for, right? So, okay. Questions on that one? Yeah, go ahead. Replacement. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for asking. Okay. Okay. So then another anterior pituitary hormone here is prolactin. Okay. Prolactin is a protein, just like growth hormone is. Its main effect is to stimulate milk production in mammary glands. Okay. And it also prevents ovulation in lactating women. And this is kind of one of those birth control things that doesn't necessarily always work. All right. If you're familiar with this, the kind of the myth that while a woman is still breastfeeding, she can't get pregnant. It's less likely for sure because of this mechanism, but it's not like 100% foolproof birth control. And so the stimulation for its release is actually more related to prolactin inhibiting hormone than it is to prolactin releasing hormone. Okay, so the hypothalamus is going to be releasing both of those, but really, so it's going to be a decrease in PIH, prolactin inhibiting hormone. And then that's going to cause prolactin release from the anterior pituitary, which then causes milk production. Okay. Also occurs a little bit of this release occurs because of estrogen release during the menstrual cycle. This is what leads to the symptom of breast swelling during menstrual cycle. Again, nipple stimulation and some other factors as well that are somewhat similar to growth hormone release stimuli. It's we do see it in males as well. Some level of erectile dysfunction can be caused by excessive release of it in males, but it's not the most common cause of erectile dysfunction at all. So we don't really have a good understanding of what its purpose is in males. Okay. All right. Questions on that? Yeah, go ahead, Ava.
Small amounts. All pills.
Yeah, there's small amounts in all males. Excessive amounts then has been linked to kind of a more of a rare form of erectile dysfunction. But yeah, so other questions? Okay, well, let's do a little bit of a recap on all of those hypothalamus hormones and the pituitary gland. So go back to that kind of color-coded image from your previous notes. Just write in what each of these does. Okay, these are our hypothalamic hormones. And for the test, you can definitely use the acronyms for sure. I think knowing the name helps you understand what it does and what it's connected to. So I do want you to know them, but if you're just like writing it out in a short answer question, you can use the acronyms for sure. And then, yeah, so then same thing over here. Which part of the pituitary is this? Are these anterior or posterior pituitary hormones, the ones below? And then what would be kind of the general actions? And then with breastfeeding, why do you think we need both oxytocin and prolactin? Okay, so let's work through that. Yeah, and then you guys can take a little break as well. We'll come back about 10:10. So it's about 12 minutes from now. So fill this out, take a break, come back about 10:10, and we'll keep going.
Right. Yeah, they'll get probably.
All right, guys, let's go ahead and come back together here. Okay, this was kind of just what I wrote in, pretty simply on the left-hand side. All those hormones are causing the release or inhibition of release of some anterior pituitary hormone, right? And so, yeah, so we'll go into the effects of most of those hormones next time if we haven't already yet. And then on the right-hand side, or this middle part here, right? So we got the two posterior pituitary hormones, oxytocin and vasopressin, right? Oxytocin, we got the letdown reflex, uterine contraction, cervix thinning and contraction. Vasopressin, water intake increase, water retention increase, which increases our blood pressure. And then we've got our effects of growth hormone here, just kind of basic general effects there. And then prolactin, we talked about milk production. The one thing that's interesting about oxytocin and prolactin working together is that oxytocin, again, causes the release part, but prolactin is needed to cause the production of milk first, right? And yeah, so that's an interesting piece there. One thing that I noticed when my wife, at least with our third kid, we had a fancier breast pump at that point, and the breast pumps will actually work to kind of try to stimulate the letdown reflex exactly the same way that babies do it. So when a baby first latches on, it sucks really rapidly, and it's pretty much just trying to get that nipple stimulation to get oxytocin release, and then the woman will feel the letdown reflex happen, and then the baby slows down. It's just like gulping milk, right? And that's exactly what the breast pumps do too. Kind of has the first phase where it's going really fast, and then when the letdown reflex happens, you press a button, and then it starts going slower, right? And we didn't really notice that our daughter was doing that until we noticed the breast pump doing that. So it's kind of a cool thing. But it's all about stimulating that reflex. And then the production is happening the whole time with prolactin, but the reflex is more quick. So questions on that? Yeah, Brittany? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so it was, yeah, because of Kyle's question, I was looking it up a little bit. Uh, yeah, when you guys were on your break, the real mechanism is prostaglandin release, and that prostaglandin release leads to multiple things, but one of those things is thinning and ripening of the cervix, and then that leads to kind of getting ready for dilation. It's not this, that's not the actual mechanism that leads to dilation itself, but it's kind of the ripening and thinning of the cervix, and then dilation happens later. But yeah, so yeah, so yeah, good question. Other questions on that? Okay. I'm gonna leave it up for a sec. Leave it up for one more sec as some of you are still writing. Yeah, go ahead.
So you had a question why off.
Like, why is that needed for breastfeeding, right? So one, prolactin is causing the production of milk, and then oxytocin is causing the release of milk, right? Yeah, sure. Okay. Other questions on this? Okay. Well, let's what again, I think one of the best ways to practice and understand any of the parts of the endocrine system they're going to be talking about over the next 2 weeks is to kind of draw out these hormone control loops yourself. Okay. Um, and so yeah, so what I'd like you to do here for growth hormone is just draw that out. And I want you to include all of the glands, which hormones are released kind of from which gland, what's the stimuli, what are the stimuli, and there's a bunch of them for growth hormones. You don't have to write them all in necessarily. Where is the negative feedback and the actions, right? And so this is the way you just want to start thinking about all of these hormones is what are all these components with all of these, okay? What are the glands involved? What are the hormones involved? What starts this whole process? What's the stimuli on top? And then what provides the negative feedback and the actions? Okay, so, and you've already written out the actions, but yeah, just go ahead and just try that for a sec with the people around you, and then we'll come back together in just a sec.
No. I remember I was like, what that girl's like, she's like ready. You have this like that every street. I saw that.
So yeah, take a stab at it. Don't wait to see mine. Not going to learn anything that way. Try it out. It's hard for the perfectionists, I know.
The IGF, just for you can see it's here. Yeah. Does IGF-1 inhibit growth hormone itself, or does it inhibit the release of growth hormone at the anterior pituitary side? Or do we have to
IGF-1
wait?
it does a couple things. Yeah, it inhibits the release of growth hormone, but then
Okay.
it also stimulates the release of somatostatin,
Uh,
which is inhibitory for the release of growth
Okay.
hormone. Yeah.
But it's not like it's denaturing growth hormone. It's
No, it's just
blocking
more of an
release.
effect on the gland. Yeah.
They did a. Or they could have sex.
Some experience on it's more. This is a negative feedback from my. How do you draw negative feedback? Do you dog line?
I just made a different color so I can tell.
Write anything.
Oh, not yet. I'm sorry.
You're waiting for me?
A little bit.
You gotta try it out. All right, let's come back together here. All of you are much better and neater and prettier writers than I am, but this is how I did it. All right, so the key thing here, we got the hypothalamus. That's our first gland, right? Releases GHRH. I didn't write in the stimuli, right? I forgot to actually, even though it said right there. But the stimuli are, we listed them all out on the other slide, but it was like sleep and exercise, hypoglycemia, a lot of those different things, right? So you would really want to put those stimuli, let's do it, sleep, exercise, etc. Let's put that in here, right, as our stimulus or stimuli, right? Because that's an important part of this, right? So that's going to tell the hypothalamus to release GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone. That's going to go to the anterior pituitary, tell it to release growth hormone. Go ahead.
Confused if your body's like in a starvation state, like
Yeah.
hypoglycemia and releasing ghrelin because you're hungry.
Yeah.
Is that stimulus?
So the hypoglycemia part is specifically related to its anti-insulin actions, right? So its anti-insulin actions lead to less of the glucose that's in your blood going into your cells, right? So then that leaves it out there more for use by your brain and things like that. And then what was the other one? Does that answer it?
Kind of confusing, yeah.
Yeah,
Ghrelin.
yeah, yeah. Ghrelin release. Yeah, like why would the same hormone that makes you hungry also make you try to grow? Yeah, yeah. You would think it would be the other way almost, right? Yeah, yeah. And I'm not sure on that. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why those are connected in that order. It could just be kind of like this continual loop, right? Like where you're needing to eat so you can grow, but it just feels like it's a little bit backwards the way we have it here. But it probably is just kind of all looped together, but that's just my guess. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, so then we've got anterior pituitary releasing growth hormone. We've got some direct effects from that. I didn't write them out because they're on the previous slide. And then we've got the growth hormone telling the liver to release IGF-1, which has some direct, indirect effects, but also the primary growth effects there. Okay. And then we have direct negative feedback to the pituitary from IGF-1. And really this one here is part of the negative feedback, but um, it's really causing the release of a hormone that's inhibitory, right? So it'd probably make more sense just to make this a solid line instead of a dotted line, and then emphasize that this is providing some negative feedback there, right? Does that make sense? So IGF-1 is causing the release of somatostatin or growth hormone inhibiting hormone, and then that decreases the release of growth hormone. That make sense? Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
The somatostatin and the growth hormone inhibiting hormone, those are used interchangeably, right?
Yeah, same one. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Other questions on that? Okay, and the reason we're just talking about those two pituitary hormones so far, there's more than growth hormone and prolactin that are released from the anterior pituitary, right? But all of the other ones have effects further downstream with another hormone release. So we'll talk about those when we get to those glands, okay? But that's why we kind of focus on those for now. Okay, so the first one of those is or are all the different ones that come from the adrenal glands. Okay, and so let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of the adrenal glands first. Okay, so we've got kind of first of all the middle part of it, the medulla, right? The blue part here is sympathetic ganglia, right? So these are neurons, right? So neurons that are in the center of this little adrenal gland that is they sit on top of our kidneys, right? And so the primary hormones released here are epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. Those hormones together are called the catecholamines. And we find them as neurotransmitters all over the place too, right? So we find them here as neurohormones. So epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, those are all the catecholamines. But 90% of what's released from this gland is epinephrine. Okay, so that's the middle, right? So epinephrine is the primary thing released here. And this is part of our autonomic nervous system, right? This is what kind of took the place of that postganglionic neuron in that different branch of our sympathetic nervous system, right? Normally we have the two neuron branch, right? Preganglionic neuron to a postganglionic neuron, then release. This is taking the place of that secondary neuron, that postganglionic neuron, and we're getting the neurotransmitter release, but then into the blood so it can go out and have a broader effect, right? So then we've got the cortex, right? So that's all of this stuff up here, right? And we have three different zones, okay? So we can see the reticularis, which is the part that's closest to the medulla. This is where androgens are released. Okay, so these are our sex hormones. We'll talk about some specifics here in a sec. We have the fasciculata, which is the zona fasciculata, which is the next part up. This is where cortisol is produced and released. And then lastly, we've got the glomerulosa. And the glomerulosa is where the primary one released is aldosterone, but we call these the mineral corticoids. Okay, so cortisol, it belongs to a group of hormones called glucocorticoids, right? Aldosterone belongs to a group of hormones called mineral corticoids that are responsible for controlling mineral levels in the body. Okay, so all of these are steroid-based hormones, right? And so all the cells in these areas have highly developed smooth endoplasmic reticula because this is what makes fats in our cells, right? So this is what we'll find in all glands is that certain cells specialize in making one hormone, right? So in the anterior pituitary gland, right, there's a group of cells that make growth hormone, right? And then another group of cells that make prolactin, another group of cells that make TSH. All the different ones are produced by certain cells, right? So when you have a tumor in a gland, it's typically going to be identified like which type of cell it is that's producing or that's tumorous, right? So yeah, and then that'll lead to most likely overproduction of that hormone specifically in that gland. Okay, questions on these at all? Okay, I'm really thrown off on time today with a different thing. I guess we're done at 10:45. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks. Okay, so just briefly here about these catecholamines. Okay, so this is just kind of a graph that shows the plasma levels of epinephrine and norepinephrine during different conditions, right? And so we can see that, yeah, when we look at, for example, exercise, right? We see big spikes. These are kind of our normal levels, right? The dotted line is kind of the normal level. So we see big spikes in epinephrine with all different kinds of stressful conditions, right? But we don't really see much of a spike in norepinephrine unless we're doing heavy exercise or we have an actual tumor, right? So the bottom line with those graphs is showing us that norepinephrine release isn't really a main factor when it comes to the adrenal gland. It's really all about epinephrine release to have the effects that we think of. Okay, and dopamine isn't really released much at all, but epinephrine is pretty much always acting. Okay, so a couple things here, and we kind of have the effects over there on each of these, and they're going to match pretty similarly to what we already talked about with the sympathetic nervous system, right? So the effects on the heart, we're going to increase heart rate, right? We're going to increase contractility. Okay, the blood vessels, and this is all based on beta 1 receptors in the heart. Okay. In the blood vessels, it's all about alpha 1 receptors. These are all noradrenergic receptors, right? So just like we talked about before, or sorry, just adrenergic receptors, not noradrenergic, but adrenergic receptors, right? And so the effects on blood vessels are going to be vasoconstriction. Right. Obviously, alertness is going to increase glucose metabolism. We're going to get glycogenolysis in the liver, right? Which that is going to increase blood glucose, right? We're breaking down that stored glycogen in our liver when we're stressed out, right? And that's going to lead to increase in blood glucose levels. So we have more of that available when we're stressed, right? And this is also obviously going to increase our metabolic rate as well. See if I forgot anything. I don't think so. Yeah, so then the pheochromocytomas, these are adrenal medulla tumors. And one of the primary things we see there is extreme hypertension. be kind of one of the primary symptoms that come about with this. But when there's a tumor in that nervous system tissue inside the adrenal gland, leads to hypertension. Okay. Questions on those? Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit about about cortisol, and we'll probably finish up with talking about cortisol today. So, all of these, again, all the hormones that the adrenal gland makes, the adrenal cortex makes, are steroid hormones. Okay, and then ACTH is the anterior pituitary hormone that leads to the formation of all three of these hormones that are created here, but has the strongest effects on cortisol. Okay, so adrenocorticotropic hormone is ACTH, right? And so the big thing, just to note here, you don't need to know all the details of this pathway, but what we're seeing here is that we would be, this would be one of those cells in the adrenal gland that produces all of these hormones, right? And so we would see ACTH binding to that. It's going to lead to the production. The kind of the big thing, we'll get into some of the details next week when we talk about production of estrogen. We'll talk about some more details on that. But kind of one of the key things is obviously we need cholesterol to do this, right? So we see LDL there, right? So cholesterol is needed for the production of these hormones. Okay. And then, yeah, and then this is showing where ACTH binds, leads to this process. And yeah, I think that's all we need to know for now. We'll get into some of the details on estrogen production and testosterone production when we get there. But the bottom line here is we need cholesterol. Yeah, again, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum is a big part of this. And that's what is shown here, the SER. Yeah, one thing we'll talk about a little bit later as we move on are these P450 enzymes. And we'll talk about some drugs that target those enzymes too. Okay. All right. You know what? I'm feeling like we'll have plenty of time tomorrow to finish the rest of this. So let's just get done a little bit early. You guys can have a little bit of extra time. So let's do that. Okay. All right, guys. Yeah. We'll see you tomorrow morning. Yes.
Wow.